Wyoming Territory, 1875. The rugged silhouette of the Grand Tetons cut jagged lines against the copper sky as the sun surrendered to dusk. The frontier was unforgiving to those who traveled alone, doubly so for a woman. Yet there she stood on the station platform in Laramie, her belongings piled at her feet, abandoned by the wagon train that had promised to carry her west to Oregon. Dustin Paxton leaned against the hitching post outside the general store, his 26-year-old frame still limber despite years breaking horses across 3 territories. His wheat-blonde hair fell just above the collar of his worn canvas jacket, and 3 days of light stubble shadowed his tanned face. He watched as the station emptied, passengers claimed by waiting family or trudging toward the hotel, all except for her. "Train's gone, miss," he finally called, pushing off from his post. "You waiting on someone?" She turned, revealing eyes the color of summer bluebells beneath the brim of her bonnet. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, had faded to the color of a clear winter sky and hung too loosely on her slender frame. She couldn't have been more than 22. "They left without me," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstance. "The Livingston wagon train. I stepped off to send a telegram, and when I returned..." She gestured to the empty tracks as if they might still reveal the dust of departed wagons. Dustin approached, removing his hat. The West had taught him one immutable truth. A man survives alone. Attachment only leads to heartbreak or a bullet. He'd buried his parents, his brother, and even his old dog, Rusty. Each loss had reinforced his belief that the frontier demanded solitude. "Felicity Rosemond," she offered, extending a gloved hand that seemed too delicate for frontier life. "I paid them half my savings to get to Portland." "Dustin Paxton," he replied, taking her hand briefly. "Were you planning to stay tonight, Miss Rosemond?" "I..." Her composure faltered. "I had not planned to stay at all." The last golden light caught in her honey-brown hair as she adjusted her bonnet. Something in her determined stance struck him. This wasn't some eastern flower wilting at the first sign of adversity. "The widow Gunderson runs a decent boarding house," he offered, already turning away. 3 blocks down, white picket fence. Tell her Dustin sent you." That should have been the end of it. The frontier had no patience for stragglers, and Dustin had no room in his life for complications. He had cattle to move, a small ranch to build, and winter preparations that wouldn't wait for misplaced Eastern women. "Mr. Paxton," she called, forcing him to turn back. "I don't suppose you know when the next wagon train heading west might assemble." He paused. "Not until spring, Miss Rosemond. Winter's coming. No one crosses the mountains now." Her face remained composed, but something flashed behind those bluebell eyes, fear, perhaps, or determination. "I see. Thank you for your kindness." 3 days later, Dustin found himself loading supplies at Jenkins' Mercantile, when the shopkeeper's wife mentioned the poor abandoned girl, taking in mending to earn her keep at the boarding house. "Shame about her situation," Mrs. Jenkins clucked. "Says she's got family waiting in Portland, brother's the only kin she has left." Dustin grunted noncommittally, but found himself listening as Mrs. Jenkins continued. "Widow Gunderson says she works till all hours, sewing by candlelight, trying to save enough for passage come spring. Though how a woman plans to cross those territories alone is beyond my understanding." That evening, as Dustin rode back to his small ranch 10 miles outside of town, the autumn wind carried a chill that promised an early winter. His cabin appeared on the horizon, and he was struck by its emptiness. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the window. Just a solitary structure against the gathering darkness, much like himself. The next morning, Dustin rode into town earlier than usual. He told himself it was for supplies he'd forgotten, but his path took him past the boarding house where he caught sight of Felicity hanging laundry, her honey-brown hair plaited down her back. She worked with efficient movements, her 22-year-old frame belying a strength he hadn't expected. "Miss Rosemond," he called, dismounting, "got a moment?" She turned, surprise evident in her face. "Mr. Paxton." "Good morning." "I'm headed west," he said without preamble. "Not all the way to Portland, but to my grazing lands near the Idaho border. I'll be driving 30 head of cattle to winter pasture." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That sounds like difficult work, Mr. Paxton." "It is. I could use a hand with the chuck wagon, someone who can manage a fire and basic meals." He shifted uncomfortably. "It would get you halfway to Portland at least." You'd have shelter and protection through the first mountain passes. Why would you offer this to a stranger? Her directness caught him off guard. Dustin hadn't prepared for the question. Winter's hard out here. Neighbors help neighbors. We're not neighbors, Mr. Paxton. No, he admitted, but we could be traveling companions at least for a while. 2 days later, they departed Laramie. Dustin rode point with the small herd, while Felicity managed the wagon that carried their supplies. He'd given her basic instructions on handling the team and planned their route to avoid the steepest terrain. Still, as they moved away from town, he wondered if he'd lost his mind, taking responsibility for not just the cattle but this woman as well. I've never seen so much open space, Felicity commented that evening as they made camp in a sheltered valley. The cattle grazed nearby and a small fire crackled between them. It's both beautiful and terrifying. Dustin nodded, watching as she efficiently prepared a simple stew. Most beautiful things out here are also dangerous. Is that why you live alone? She asked, stirring the pot. Because connection is dangerous. Her perception unsettled him. I live alone because it's practical, no one to worry about but myself. Yet here you are worrying about me and these cattle, she smiled softly. Perhaps practicality isn't the whole story, Mr. Paxton. Dustin, he corrected. If we're traveling together, might as well use my given name. Felicity then, she offered in return. After a moment's hesitation, she added, my brother James is all the family I have left. Our parents died of fever 3 years ago. He went west to establish himself and sent for me when he'd found work as a schoolteacher. Dustin nodded, accepting this information without offering any of his own history in return. They ate in companionable silence as stars emerged in the vast Wyoming sky. The days that followed established a rhythm. They would rise before dawn, prepare the camp for moving, and drive the cattle until mid-afternoon. Each evening, they'd make a new camp, and Dustin found himself impressed by how quickly Felicity adapted to the rigors of trail life. On the 4th night, as they camped beside a creek lined with cottonwoods, Dustin returned from checking the herd to find Felicity with her skirts hitched up, wading in the shallows. Hope you don't mind, she called, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. It's been days since I've felt properly clean. Creek's free for all, he replied, turning slightly to give her privacy. Just watch for snakes. A small gasp followed by splashing told him his warning had had its effect. He couldn't help the smile that tugged at his lips. That wasn't funny, she said later, her hair damp but her spirits seemingly lifted by the improvised bath. Wasn't joking, he replied. Saw a water moccasin in that bend last summer. Her eyes widened. Is everything out here trying to kill visitors? Pretty much, he admitted. That's why people either leave or learn. And you, she asked, you learned. Dustin poked at the fire. Had no choice, came west with my family when I was 14. Pa wanted land of his own. By 16 I was burying them, Ma, Pa, and my little brother Caleb. Influenza swept through our settlement. The words emerged unbidden, surprising him. He hadn't spoken of his family in years. I'm sorry, she said simply, making no move to offer physical comfort, something he found himself grateful for. Is that when you decided to be alone? He considered her question, figured it was safer. Can't lose what you don't have. Felicity wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. That sounds sensible, except the heart doesn't follow sense, does it? We find people to care for whether we plan to or not. Dustin had no response to that. Instead, he showed her how to bank the fire for the night. The next morning brought trouble. Dustin woke to the sound of restless cattle and discovered 3 missing from the herd. The tracks told the story. Rustlers had cut them from the group during the night. Stay with the wagon and the herd, he instructed Felicity, checking his rifle. I'll be back before sundown. And if you're not, she asked, fear evident in her voice. Then get yourself to the settlement at Devil's Gate. It's a day's ride northeast. Ask for Marshal Cooper. As he mounted his horse, she caught his sleeve. Be careful, Dustin. He nodded once, then rode off following the cattle tracks. The trail led him through rocky terrain and into a narrow canyon. By midday, he'd located the missing animals in a makeshift corral hidden among the rocks. 2 men sat nearby, cooking over a small fire. Dustin approached cautiously, rifle ready. The older of the 2 spotted him first, reaching for his gun. I wouldn't, Dustin called, his rifle steady. Just want my cattle back. The younger rustler, barely more than a boy, looked nervously between his partner and Dustin. Told you someone would come looking. After a tense negotiation with guns still drawn, the rustlers agreed to release the cattle. Dustin suspected they recognized they'd picked the wrong target. His brand was known in these parts, as was his reputation with a rifle. By the time he returned to camp, the sun was setting. He found Felicity standing beside the chuck wagon, his spare pistol gripped in her hand. "Heard you coming," she explained, lowering the weapon. Relief washed over her face. "The cattle." "All accounted for," he assured her, dismounting. Only then did he notice the bruise forming on her cheek. "What happened?" Felicity touched her face self-consciously. "A visitor, after you left, said he was looking for directions, but his eyes," she shuddered slightly. "I convinced him to move along." With that, Dustin nodded toward the pistol. "Yes, though I've never fired one before," she admitted. "I was bluffing." Anger flared in Dustin's chest, not at her, but at himself for leaving her vulnerable. "I'll teach you tomorrow, no bluffing required." The next morning, he set up empty cans on a fallen log and showed Felicity how to hold, aim, and fire the pistol. Her first shots went wild, but by the 10th attempt, she was hitting the target consistently. "Not bad for a city girl," he remarked, impressed by her determination. "I'm from Philadelphia, not some mythical realm of delicate flowers," she retorted, reloading as he'd shown her. "My father believed in self-reliance. He just never thought that would include firearms." As they continued westward, the terrain grew more challenging. The foothills of the Rockies loomed before them, and early snow dusted the higher elevations. Dustin found himself watching Felicity with growing admiration. She never complained about the long days or cold nights, instead adapting and learning with quiet determination. One evening, as they huddled close to the fire against the autumn chill, Dustin caught himself studying her profile. The delicate line of her jaw, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks in the firelight. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth he quickly suppressed. "Tell me about your brother," he said, diverting his thoughts. "What kind of man leaves his sister to cross the frontier alone?" Felicity's eyes flashed defensively. "James didn't abandon me. He's been ill, tuberculosis. The doctors recommended the drier climate of Oregon. He went ahead to establish a home for us both." Dustin immediately regretted his accusation. "Sorry. Didn't mean to imply." "It's all right," she interrupted. "You couldn't have known, and truthfully I wonder sometimes if I was foolish to attempt this journey, but what choice did I have? He's my only family." "Family's important," Dustin agreed, thinking of his own lost kin. "Worth fighting for." Felicity studied him thoughtfully. "Yet you fight alone." Before he could respond, a distant howl cut through the night. The cattle shifted nervously. "Wolves," Dustin explained, reaching for his rifle. "I'll keep watch, you should get some sleep." But Felicity didn't move. "I'll stay up with you. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. They sat in vigilant silence, shoulders occasionally brushing as they fed the fire. Dustin couldn't remember the last time he'd shared a quiet night watch with anyone. The warmth of her presence beside him felt both foreign and strangely right. When the wolves finally appeared at the edge of the firelight, they came as ghostly shadows with hungry eyes. Dustin fired a warning shot and the pack retreated temporarily. "They'll be back," he warned. "Hungry wolves don't give up easily." "Neither do hungry humans," Felicity replied, her pistol ready in her lap. "We'll face them together." The wolves tested their defenses twice more that night before finally abandoning the hunt near dawn. As pale light crept over the horizon, Dustin found Felicity sleeping against his shoulder, her features softened in slumber. Something protective and fierce woke in him, a feeling he'd thought long buried with his family. The realization troubled him. Attachment in the frontier meant vulnerability, and vulnerability got people killed. Yet as Felicity stirred and offered him a sleepy smile, he couldn't bring himself to rebuild the walls she'd somehow slipped past. "We should reach Bear Creek by evening," he told her as they broke camp. "Small settlement. We can resupply there." Bear Creek proved to be little more than a trading post with a saloon and a handful of cabins clustered around a swift-flowing stream. As they approached, Dustin noticed Felicity straightening her dress and adjusting her bonnet. small gestures of civilization that seemed oddly touching after days on the trail. The trading post owner, a gruff man named Hobson, eyed them speculatively as they entered his establishment. "Don't often see a woman with a cattle drive," he remarked, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Mrs. Paxton's accompanying me to our winter range," Dustin replied smoothly, the lie falling easily from his lips. He felt rather than saw Felicity's startled glance. Hobson nodded, his attitude shifting subtly to one of respect. "Weather's turning fast this year. You planning to winter at your usual spot by the Idaho line?" "That's the plan," Dustin confirmed, adding more supplies to their order. Later, as they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Felicity confronted him. "Mrs. Paxton." Dustin secured a sack of flour before answering. Frontier settlements respect married women, single females attract unwanted attention. "I see," she said, her expression unreadable. "A practical decision." "Nothing but," he agreed, though something in his tone lacked conviction. They spent the night at Bear Creek, Felicity taking a room at the small boarding house while Dustin slept in the wagon to guard their supplies. In the morning, they continued westward, the mountains drawing ever closer. 3 days later, disaster struck. A sudden autumn storm swept down from the mountains, bringing driving rain that quickly turned to sleet. The cattle grew restless, and the trail became treacherously muddy. As they crossed a swollen stream, the chuck wagon lurched violently. One wheel caught on a submerged rock and snapped, sending Felicity tumbling into the frigid water. Dustin was off his horse in an instant, plunging into the stream. The current pulled at Felicity's sodden skirts, dragging her toward deeper water. He caught her arm just as she went under, hauling her back to the surface and against his chest. Together they fought the current until they reached the muddy bank. Felicity coughed up water, shivering violently in the cold air. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that filled Dustin with dread. "Need to get you warm," he said, gathering her into his arms. The wagon was useless with its broken wheel, but he spotted a rocky outcropping that might provide shelter from the driving sleet. He carried her to the rocks, finding a shallow cave just large enough for 2 people. After settling Felicity inside, he retrieved his bedroll and what dry supplies he could salvage from the wagon. The cattle would have to fend for themselves until the storm passed. "UN need to change," he told her through chattering teeth. "Everything's soaked through." "Turn around," she managed, fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. Dustin faced the cave entrance, listening to the rustle of wet fabric behind him. The storm showed no signs of abating, and night was falling. They needed fire, but every piece of kindling in sight was soaked. "Done," Felicity finally said. When he turned, she had wrapped herself in his dry blanket, her wet clothes spread on a nearby rock. Her honey-brown hair hung in damp tendrils around her pale face. "Your turn," she said, averting her eyes. Dustin changed quickly into his spare shirt and pants, both slightly damp but better than his drenched clothing. There was only the one dry blanket between them, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. "We need to share body heat," he said matter-of-factly, "or risk freezing." Felicity nodded, a hint of color returning to her cheeks. "I understand." He sat beside her, wrapping the blanket around them both. Hesitantly, she leaned against him, her body still trembling with cold. Dustin placed an arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "My brother would be scandalized," she murmured, a hint of humor in her voice despite their dire situation. "Reckon he'd prefer you alive and scandalized than frozen with your propriety intact," Dustin replied. As night deepened, the storm's fury increased. Wind howled at the cave entrance, occasionally driving sleet inside. They huddled closer, sharing what warmth they could generate. Dustin found himself acutely aware of Felicity's presence, the scent of her hair, the weight of her head against his shoulder, the trust implicit in her proximity. "Tell me something about yourself," she requested softly, "something you haven't told anyone in a long time." Dustin was silent for so long that she might have thought he'd fallen asleep, but finally he spoke. "I write poetry sometimes. Terrible stuff, probably, but when the land looks a certain way at sunset or when the first spring flowers push through the snow, I try to capture it in words." Felicity shifted to look up at him, surprise and delight in her eyes. "Will you recite one for me?" "Not a chance," he replied, but his tone was gentle. "Your turn, tell me something." She settled back against him. "I'm terrified of failing my brother." of arriving in Portland to find him gone, or worse. Some nights on this journey, I've lain awake wondering if I'm chasing a ghost. The vulnerability in her admission struck a chord in Dustin. "We'll get you to your brother," he promised. "Whatever it takes." When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. A thin layer of snow covered the ground, and ice glinted on tree branches. The cattle had scattered but remained within sight of the stream. "The wagon wheel's beyond repair," Dustin assessed after examining the damage. "We'll have to redistribute what we can carry and continue on horseback." Felicity surveyed their situation with practical eyes. "How far to the winter pasture?" 3 days' ride, weather permitting," he replied. "There's a line shack there, basic shelter but solid. We could wait out the early winter until the pass is clear enough to get you to a stage stop for Portland." "What about the cattle?" "They'll make it on their own now that we're this close. They know where the good grazing is." He began sorting through their supplies, setting aside only what was essential. "The real question is whether you're ready to ride double with me for 3 days." Felicity straightened, squaring her shoulders despite her still damp clothing. "Mr. Paxton, after nearly drowning yesterday and spending the night in a cave, I believe I can manage sharing a horse with you." The journey that followed tested them both. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, with patches of ice in shadowed areas. They rode together on Dustin's sturdy gelding, Felicity seated before him, his arms around her to hold the reins. The forced intimacy should have made them uncomfortable, but instead, it felt oddly natural. By the second day, they had settled into a rhythm. Dustin found himself telling stories of his years on the frontier. The first time he broke a wild Mustang, the winter he got lost in a blizzard and survived by digging a snow cave, the strange beauty of the mountains in spring when wildflowers carpeted valleys that had been snowbound for months. In turn, Felicity spoke of her life in Philadelphia, her father's watchmaking shop, the books she'd loved as a child, her mother's garden with its neat rows of herbs and vegetables. "I never imagined I'd end up here," she admitted as they made camp for their final night before reaching the line shack. "Riding through the mountains with a cowboy poet." Dustin chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. "Don't think I qualify as either a proper cowboy or a poet." "What would you call yourself then?" she asked, her bluebell eyes reflecting the campfire. He considered the question seriously. "A survivor, I suppose." "Until recently." "And now?" "Now I'm not sure," he admitted. "Something's changing." The look that passed between them held more meaning than either was ready to acknowledge. Dustin found himself wondering what it would be like to arrive at his winter pasture not alone, but with Felicity beside him. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. They reached the line shack by midday on the third day. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed. Dustin immediately set about gathering firewood, while Felicity swept years of dust from the floor and surfaces. By evening, they had transformed the shack into something approaching comfortable. A fire crackled in the hearth, coffee bubbled in a pot at the edge of the flames, and their remaining supplies were neatly organized on the shelves. "It's a far cry from Philadelphia," Dustin remarked, watching Felicity arrange her few belongings, "but it'll keep the snow off." "It has a certain charm," she replied, running her hand along the rough-hewn table. "I can see why you come here." "Never shared it before," he admitted. "Always been just me and the mountains." She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "And how does it feel, sharing it now?" "Better than I expected," he said softly. "A lot of things with you have been better than expected, Felicity." The days that followed established a new rhythm. Mornings, they would check on the cattle, now grazing contentedly in the sheltered valley below the shack. Afternoons were spent preparing for the deepening winter, chopping wood, hunting for fresh meat, patching the shack's roof where it leaked. Evenings were passed in conversation beside the fire, their initial wariness giving way to genuine friendship and something deeper that neither dared name. One morning, Dustin woke to find Felicity already outside, standing at the edge of the clearing. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, transforming the landscape into a glistening white expanse. She wore his spare coat, her honey-brown hair loose around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's beautiful," she said as he joined her. "I've never seen anything like it." Dustin looked not at the landscape, but at her. Neither have I. She turned to face him, something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression. Dustin, I. Her words were cut short by the distant sound of hoofbeats. They both tensed, Dustin automatically reaching for his rifle. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the tree line, moving steadily toward the shack. As they drew closer, Dustin recognized the lead rider, Marshal Cooper from Devil's Gate, accompanied by 2 deputies. Paxton, Cooper called, reining in his horse. Thought that might be your herd in the valley. Cooper, Dustin acknowledged cautiously. What brings the law this far west? Looking for rustlers, Cooper replied, dismounting. His gaze shifted to Felicity, surprise evident in his weathered features. Ma'am. Felicity nodded politely, moving slightly closer to Dustin. Something protective surged in his chest at the gesture. My wife, Dustin said, the lie from Bear Creek becoming truth in his heart. Felicity. Cooper removed his hat. Mrs. Paxton didn't know Dustin here had married. Recent development, Dustin replied smoothly. What rustlers? Turner gang, Cooper explained. Been hitting ranches across 3 territories. Heard they might be wintering in these parts. Dustin frowned. Haven't seen any sign of them, but we've only been here a week or so. Mind if we warm up a bit before moving on? Cooper asked, eyeing the smoke from the shack's chimney. They all moved inside, where Felicity set about preparing coffee for the visitors. Cooper watched her with undisguised curiosity. How'd a confirmed bachelor like you end up with a wife, Paxton? He asked quietly while Felicity was occupied at the fireplace. Got lucky, Dustin replied simply. Cooper chuckled. Must be more to it than that. Before Dustin could respond, one of the deputies called out from the doorway. Marshal, riders coming up from the South Valley. Everyone tensed. Cooper moved to the window, peering out cautiously. 5 of them, armed, could be our rustlers. Dustin joined him at the window. The approaching riders moved with the confident ease of men accustomed to violence. That's them all right. I recognize the lead man from wanted posters. Cooper turned to Felicity. Ma'am, you might want to hide yourself, these men. I can shoot, she interrupted, already retrieving Dustin's spare pistol from its holster. And I won't cower while you men risk your lives. Dustin wanted to protest to keep her safe, but the determined set of her jaw told him it would be futile. Instead, he positioned her at the window farthest from the door, where she would have a clear shot if needed. Stay low, he instructed, and remember what I taught you about breathing before you pull the trigger. The approaching riders stopped about 50 yards from the shack. Their leader, a man with a distinctive red bandana, called out, Hello, the cabin, just looking for a place to warm up. That's Eli Turner, Cooper muttered. Wanted for murder in 2 territories. What's your business here? Dustin shouted back, his rifle ready. Passing through, Turner replied. Saw your smoke, cold day for traveling. Cooper and his deputies exchanged glances. They were outnumbered but had the advantage of the shack's walls. You men are welcome to move on, Cooper called. This cabin's occupied by the law. A tense silence followed. Then with frightening suddenness, the Turner gang spurred their horses forward, guns drawn. The next moments passed in a chaotic blur of gunfire and shouting. Dustin fired through the window, dropping 1 rider. Cooper and his deputies engaged the others. Beside him, Felicity fired the pistol with surprising accuracy, forcing 1 attacker to dive for cover. Bullets splintered the wooden walls of the shack. Glass shattered as a shot took out one of the small windows. Dustin moved constantly, positioning himself to protect Felicity while maintaining his line of fire. The firefight seemed to last forever, though in reality it was over in minutes. 2 of the Turner gang lay unmoving in the snow. Another was wounded, clutching his arm as he retreated. Eli Turner and his remaining man mounted their horses and fled, disappearing into the tree line. Inside the shack, 1 deputy had taken a bullet to the shoulder. Felicity immediately tore strips from her petticoat to bandage the wound, her hands steady despite the violence they'd just endured. They'll be back, Cooper warned, reloading his pistol. Turner doesn't like losing. We need to move, Dustin agreed. This shack is too exposed. Cooper nodded toward the wounded deputy. He can't travel far. Dustin considered their options. There's a cave system in the North Ridge, defensible. Hard to find if you don't know it's there. How far? Cooper asked. 3 miles rough terrain. Felicity finished bandaging the deputy. "We can make it together." The decision made, they gathered what supplies they could carry and abandoned the shack. Dustin led the way, helping Felicity navigate the steep, snow-covered slopes. Behind them came Cooper, supporting the wounded deputy, with the second deputy covering their rear. They reached the caves as the short winter day was fading. The entrance was narrow, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the space opened into a series of interconnected chambers, the largest big enough to stand in comfortably. "Used to be a bear den," Dustin explained as they settled in the main chamber. "Found it my second winter out here. No bears now, but plenty of bats in the summer." "Charming," Felicity remarked dryly, but her smile took any sting from the words. Cooper set the wounded deputy against one wall. "Turner will have a hard time finding us here." "He might give up, head for easier targets," the second deputy suggested hopefully. Dustin shook his head. "Men like Turner don't give up, especially not after losing 2 of his gang." They established a watch rotation, with one person always guarding the cave entrance. The wounded deputy drifted in and out of consciousness, his face pale beneath his dark beard. Felicity tended him with gentle competence, using snow melted over their small, smokeless fire to cool his fever. During his watch shift, Dustin found himself reflecting on how much had changed in the weeks since he'd first seen Felicity standing alone on the Laramie station platform. The solitary existence he'd built, the walls he'd constructed around his heart, all of it was crumbling in the face of her courage and compassion. He told himself he was helping her reach her brother, nothing more. But somewhere between Laramie and this cave, she'd become essential to him. The thought of continuing to his winter pasture alone, of returning to his empty cabin come spring, filled him with a hollowness he couldn't ignore. When Felicity came to relieve him of watch duty, he caught her hand. "You should be resting." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too much happening up here." She tapped her temple. Dustin didn't release her hand. "When this is over, when we've dealt with Turner, what then?" Her bluebell eyes searched his face. "You promised to get me to my brother." "And I will," he assured her, "if that's still what you want." "What do you mean?" Dustin struggled to find the right words, unused to expressing such feelings. "I mean there might be options. Other places you could belong." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Are you asking me to stay, Dustin?" "I'm asking if you would consider it," he said quietly. "With me, not as a pretend wife for frontier propriety, but as my actual wife, if you wanted that." Felicity's free hand rose to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle against his stubbled jaw. "I think I would want that very much." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility. Then a shout from inside the cave shattered their private world. "Marshal, Deputy Jenkins is worse." They rushed back inside to find the wounded deputy convulsing, his bandages soaked through with blood. Cooper knelt beside him, face grim. "Internal bleeding," he said. "He needs a doctor." "Nearest doctor's in Devil's Gate," Dustin replied. 2 days' ride in good weather." "He doesn't have 2 days," Cooper said bluntly. Felicity examined the wound, her expression grave. "The bullet may have nicked an artery. I've seen similar wounds when my father volunteered at the Veterans Hospital after the war." "Can you help him?" Cooper asked, desperation edging his voice. She hesitated. "I can try to find the bleeder and tie it off, but I'm not a surgeon." "You're all he's got," Cooper said simply. What followed was a harrowing improvised surgery. Dustin heated his hunting knife in the fire while Felicity prepared what few medical supplies they had. The deputy was given whiskey from Cooper's flask, then held down as Felicity cut into his shoulder to locate the source of bleeding. Her hands remained steady even as blood welled around her fingers. Dustin provided light from a small lantern, watching in awe as she methodically explored the wound, finally locating and tying off a small, pulsing artery with a thread from her own dress. When it was done, the deputy lay unconscious but breathing steadily. His bleeding stopped. Felicity sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands and forearms stained with blood. "That was remarkable," Cooper said, genuine respect in his voice. Felicity shook her head. "I only did what anyone would have." "No," Dustin countered gently, "not anyone. Just you." Later, as they washed the blood from her hands using melted snow, Dustin asked, "Where did you learn to do that?" I assisted the doctors sometimes, she explained. After the war, there were so many wounded veterans. Extra hands were always needed. I paid attention. You're a woman of many surprises, Felicity Rosemond. Soon to be Paxton, if I understood your earlier proposition correctly, she replied, a smile warming her tired face. Dustin's heart swelled at her words. That offer stands, though I should warn you, my cabin's not much more comfortable than this cave. I'm not looking for comfort, she said. I'm looking for home. And I think I may have found it with you. The tender moment was interrupted by the second deputy rushing in from watch. Riders approaching, at least 3 of them. Eli Turner had found them. What followed was a tense standoff. The cave entrance provided excellent defense, too narrow for more than one person to enter at a time. But they were trapped inside with limited supplies and a wounded man who couldn't be moved. We can wait them out, Cooper suggested. They'll tire of sitting in the cold. Or they could smoke us out, Dustin countered grimly. One torch thrown inside and this place becomes uninhabitable. Felicity listened to their debate, then offered her own solution. What if we made them think we've escaped, draw them away from the cave? The men looked at her with varying degrees of surprise and consideration. How? Cooper asked. There must be another way out of these caves, she reasoned. Even if it's too small for us to use, we could send something through, create tracks in the snow that lead away from here. Dustin nodded slowly. There is another exit, tight squeezed through some rocks about 50 yards back. Comes out higher on the ridge. Perfect, Felicity said. We create a false trail, make them think we've fled when they follow it. We ambush them, Cooper finished, a grim smile forming beneath his mustache. It might work. Dustin hesitated. It's dangerous if they don't all follow the false trail. Everything about this situation is dangerous, Felicity pointed out pragmatically. But doing nothing is the most dangerous of all. The plan was set in motion. Dustin crawled through the narrow back passage, dragging a bundle of branches behind him to create the appearance of multiple people moving through the snow. He circled wide, laying a trail that suggested their group had fled toward a distant ridge. When he returned, Cooper was preparing to position himself and his remaining deputy along the false trail, ready to ambush Turner and his men when they followed. What about me? Felicity asked, loading the pistol with steady hands. You stay here, Dustin said firmly. Guard Jenkins. I can fight, she protested. I've proven that. I know you can, he acknowledged. That's why I need you here. If something goes wrong, if Turner doubles back, Jenkins can't defend himself. She studied his face, reading the unspoken fear there, his terror of losing her. All right, she finally agreed. But come back to me, Dustin Paxton. We have plans to discuss. Count on it, he promised. The 3 men moved out, positioning themselves at strategic points along the false trail. The winter afternoon was waning, shadows lengthening across the snow. Dustin found a position behind a large boulder, rifle ready, and settled in to wait. It wasn't long before he heard the approach of horses. Voices carried in the clear mountain air, Turner directing his remaining men to follow the tracks. They passed close to Dustin's hiding place, 3 riders moving cautiously along the trail he'd created. Cooper's signal, a bird call that didn't belong in these mountains in winter, alerted Dustin that everyone was in position. When Turner and his men reached the narrow pass between 2 rocky outcroppings, Cooper called out, Eli Turner, you're surrounded. Throw down your weapons. What followed was brief but violent. Turner immediately opened fire, diving from his horse for cover. His men followed suit. Dustin picked off one with a clean shot, while Cooper engaged Turner directly. The remaining outlaw exchanged fire with the deputy before taking a bullet to the chest. Turner, realizing he was now alone, attempted to retreat, directly toward Dustin's position. As the outlaw rounded the boulder, Dustin rose to confront him. It's over, Turner. The outlaw's eyes burned with hatred. Nothing's ever over, he snarled, raising his pistol with lightning speed. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Dustin felt a burning pain across his ribs as Turner's bullet grazed him. His own shot caught the outlaw squarely in the chest. Turner staggered backward, a look of surprise replacing the hatred in his eyes, before collapsing into the snow. Cooper arrived moments later, taking in the scene with a professional eye. You hit. Just a graze, Dustin replied, pressing a hand to his side. The wound stung, but the bleeding was minimal. Turner. Cooper checked the fallen outlaw. Dead, good riddance. They returned to the cave victorious, but sobered by the violence. Felicity rushed to Dustin when she saw the blood on his shirt, her face pale with fear. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her, though he winced as she helped him remove his coat. "Barely a scratch." Her expression told him she didn't believe the downplaying, but she set about cleaning and bandaging the wound with the same competence she'd shown with Deputy Jenkins. "You were right," Cooper told Felicity as she worked. "Your plan was sound." "Sometimes a fresh perspective helps," she replied, securing the bandage around Dustin's ribs. "And sometimes men are too busy planning frontal assaults to consider alternatives." Cooper chuckled. "Point taken, Mrs. Paxton." The next morning, with the Turner threat eliminated, they prepared to leave the cave. Deputy Jenkins was weak but stable, able to ride with support. Cooper and his remaining deputy would take him directly to Devil's Gate for proper medical attention. "What about you two?" Cooper asked as they stood in the crisp mountain air. "Coming to town?" Dustin glanced at Felicity, who stood beside him, her hand tucked into his. "Not yet. I think we'll head back to the line shack for now. Come spring, we'll need to make a journey to Portland." "To see my brother," Felicity explained, "and to invite him to the wedding." Cooper smiled beneath his mustache. "Thought you were already married." "Soon enough," Dustin replied. "As soon as we can find a preacher." After the lawman departed, Dustin and Felicity returned to the line shack. The evidence of the gunfight remained: splintered wood, broken glass, bloodstains in the snow. But together they set about repairs, transforming the simple structure back into a home. That evening, as they sat before the rebuilt fire, Dustin found himself filled with a contentment he'd long forgotten existed. Felicity leaned against him, her honey-brown hair loose around her shoulders, her bluebell eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "We should reach Portland by late spring," he said, his arm around her shoulders. "Your brother will be wondering where you are." "Yes," she agreed, "though I'll have quite a story to tell him. Sorry for the delay, James. I was busy falling in love with a cowboy poet and fighting outlaws in the mountains." Dustin smiled, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. He might not believe half of it. "The important parts are true enough," she replied, turning to face him. "I came west looking for my only family, and instead I found a new one. Found you. And I found someone worth breaking all my rules for," he admitted. "Someone who made me realize that surviving alone isn't really living at all." As snow began to fall softly outside the shack's windows, Dustin Paxton and Felicity Rosemond sealed their future with a kiss. The lonely cowboy and the woman left behind had found in each other not just companionship, but a love strong enough to withstand the harshest frontier. A love that would, indeed, become the stuff of legend in the years to come.